very much for inviting me. Can you hear me? That's the first thing to check.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm actually sitting here in South London, and all the rest of you are in or close to Aberdeen, a different city and a different country. And I do feel I ought to explain why I'm here. I am, of course, aware of your long history of discussions about road construction and traffic reduction with quite controversial schemes. And I've been involved in the same sort of discussion in other places. And the idea was that I should visit Aberdeen, make a judgment about your schemes, look through all the paperwork and so on, make some recommendations, and then put them back to you for discussion. That's all quite normal in this sort of event. But the plan fell at the first hurdle because it was impossible to visit. Now it's possible to do a certain amount on paper and on Zoom and so on, but there is an issue of principle. I've done quite a lot of work with Professor Carmen Haas-Clough, who's the who wrote the book about comparing transport in different cities. And she gave me some very strong advice once. She said, never try to make recommendations for any city without actually walking its streets first until you know it well enough. Some consultants can, but I couldn't, and I couldn't visit, and I don't do that, and it's not helpful to you if I pretend to have greater first-hand knowledge of Aberdeen than I have. So plan B for the seminar is, what can we learn from history? And I think it's convenient to start with 1989, when Margaret Thatcher launched what was then called the biggest road programme since the Romans to cope with forecast traffic growth. It was abandoned within 5 years because the calculations showed that even a road programme twice as big as the biggest one since the Romans could not keep pace with traffic growth, so congestion would keep on increasing. And there was also a problem with the traffic forecasts themselves. Every time the British government produced traffic forecasts since about 1987, initially for Britain and then for England, they overestimated long-term traffic growth. And there was a dilemma in the appraisal of the road schemes. If the forecasts were right, the road construction planned couldn't keep up with it. But if the forecasts were wrong, the roads planned were not actually the right roads. They weren't necessary. That's been a continual dilemma, and it still applies. There quickly emerged during the 1990s another problem. Building roads actually increases the amount of traffic, naturally enough. If the price, in this case the price of time, goes down, the demand goes up. It's what you'd expect. In 1994, a government technical advisory committee measured this, and it's still a problem. Many of the English road schemes still overestimate traffic forecasts, but underestimate the induced traffic that the roads will cause. So the projects are not actually as beneficial as had been hoped. Fine at the time of launch, but disappointment later on. Now that led to all sorts of revisions of the whole process during the 1990s, and a very strong learning experience. It was one of the times when the country was internationally oriented, and we learned mostly, I think, from what was going on in two countries. German town centre pedestrianisation were particularly influential, because these were major pedestrianised schemes, not just a shopping street or two, but the entire town centres. The leaders in that were Nuremberg and Freiburg. And if you visit either, it really blows your mind to see how big an area can be restricted to traffic and be highly commercially successful, simply because the conditions of travel and access to the centre enabled this. The other major influence was traffic calming, especially in the Netherlands. The Netherlands were the leaders in what to do about traffic in residential areas, shifting the balance of power so that there was traffic, but it was kept in reasonable proportions. And it became possible again to play in the streets. The Netherlands later also became the international world-class model for cycling. And obviously, the cycling enthusiasts here will be well familiar with that. Now, both pedestrianisation of central areas and traffic calming in pedestrianisation of central areas and traffic calming in residential areas depend on a reallocation of road space from cars to other purposes. And some of those are for other purposes, are for methods of transport which make more efficient use of space, buses and trams and bicycles and walking. And some of the other purposes are not transport at all. They're pavement cafes, street life, parks, markets, even houses. But in either case, the worry was that the road network simply would not be able to cope with the displaced traffic, vehicle traffic, if you reallocated capacity from it. And that led to a key research question. If building more road space generated more traffic, might reallocating road space away from vehicle traffic actually reduce the volume of traffic? And that was the start of a research interest, which I think still continues and has become particularly prominent in recent discussions about local low traffic networks. The main work on this was a report in 1998 and an update in 2002. It asked the question, an empirical question, practical question, not whether this was a good policy or not, but what actually happens when you reduce road capacity. It looked at 100, I think, maybe specific before and after studies in particular places, and a wider experience in about 200, nearly all urban areas throughout the world. And that was really very interesting. This graph, each of those lines you can see on the graph is one place. And the first thing you notice is how wide the different experience was in the different places. There's no uniform experience. The length of the lines measure the size of the traffic change before and after, and the direction of the lines measure whether it was reducing or increasing. And I want to mention a couple of results at the top and bottom of those results. Sorry, I didn't show you the right graph. I want to mention a couple of results at the top and bottom of those results. At the top, we see the German towns I mentioned, Nuremberg and Freiburg. Here, the traffic reduced by more than 100%. Now, you know that's not arithmetically possible, but by that I mean the traffic was reduced to zero in the places where it wasn't allowed, of course, but also there were reductions in traffic in other areas where it was still allowed. This result is quite rare, but it's important because of the commercial success of the towns that did that. Most of the schemes in the middle did see some modest amount of traffic reductions through reallocation of road capacity away from from vehicle traffic. Not huge, but enough to enable the improvements which were done for other reasons, bus lanes, cycle lanes, and so on, to go ahead. Now, at the bottom, you'll see some places where the total volume of traffic increased. There were in particular 6 small towns where they did 2 things at once. They did some pedestrianisation of shopping streets, taking street space away from cars, but they also built some bypasses, which was intended to reduce the traffic pressure in the centre, and that would allow the pedestrian improvements to take place. That was the logic. And what happened was a net increase in the total volume of traffic, because the induced traffic from the bypasses was greater than the reduced traffic in the centre. And that was a key result which affects how you get a balanced transport policy without actually increasing the total volume of traffic. Now I want to move on to a quite different development that was taking place in the 2000s. Until now, I've been talking about the total amount of traffic, and that's important not only for congestion, but also for health and carbon and accessibility. And so all the traffic forecasts were about the total volume of traffic. But what was happening since the early 1990s, but we only became aware of it from about 2000, was quite unexpected. At the same time as the overall amount of traffic was increasing, just a little each year, what became clear is that the car use by younger people was actually going down, while for older people it was going up. The dividing line between young and old in this particular case was somewhere between 45 and 50. And we weren't only talking about teenagers, car use going down, it was also the young adults. And the reductions were greater in urban areas, even in the small towns. So you have 2 quite different social trends going on at the same time. And in the long run, that's important. Now, I don't know what the effect of COVID-19 and Brexit is having on these trends. Nobody knows that. And of course, actually, nobody knows what the longer run effect of pandemic and Brexit is. All we know is that any confidence we had before in the long-term trends and our ability to forecast them, and it wasn't very great, but any confidence that we did have in those long-term trends before is now very much less certain. And in the middle of this uncertainty, the British Treasury published a month or 2 ago an almost entirely unnoticed report of initial interest to very few people, though I was one of them. And this is a review of what transport nerds call the Green Book. Now, the Green Book is the set of principles which are used to guide the appraisal of value for money of big projects, especially transport projects, especially road construction, but it can be applied quite widely. And it's been a powerful influence on appraisal for decades, including on what the Department for Transport does in relation to road schemes. And the reviewers said that the present system gives a damning critique of the way in which cost-benefit ratios, the BCRs, have been distorted. It reported that there has been an artificial incentive to boost the BCR with benefits that are unlikely to be realized, and that too much effort is expended to boost the BCR to some pass mark that would have been better spent on strategic coherence, risk management, and significant unquantifiable factors. That is what it said the time and effort and consultant studies and planning process should take more attention of: strategic coherence, risk management, and significant unquantifiable factors. What they didn't say was what to do about the projects which have been appraised in this inadequate way. What I've been arguing is that there's an inescapable logic that if we've inherited a program and project whose appraisal, at that time, following the rules, has been distorted and unreliable, we have to review the results and recalculate the answers. Paradoxically, for reasons, of course, that we didn't choose, now is a good time to do that, since the distractions of pandemic and Brexit and the consequent pressures on political attention and management abilities and finance could well do with a pause while we think again. Now, what might such a reappraisal consider? And that's where I thought there are some questions which might be helpful to you, which I'll put as questions, not as critique of what you've been doing. The strategic questions are: has the importance of carbon been taken adequately into account in the transport planning? What were the calculations about that? Has the effect of the uncertainties about Brexit and COVID-19 been taken into account? Are the decisions robust to the long-term unknown effects of those? What are the effects of the financial and budget constraints that we're now expecting to live with for some considerable period into the future? And then, of course, Aberdeen is within Scotland, and it's within the UK, and it's within EU in ways which are yet to be resolved, which also will affect the travels and nature and patterns of travel and what happens about the future. How can we ensure that transport interventions help the carbon targets, as well as other objectives of public policy on health and economic viability and safety and quality of life? And what do we do about the huge uncertainties about the future? Now, I understand, of course, that Aberdeen will work these out in a way which relates to Scottish targets, not to English ones. The new transport strategy for Scotland talks about a 20% reduction in traffic. That's ambitious. And for clarification, that's not about 20% less on the forecast. That's about 20% less than we've actually got. It's not about forecasting at all. It's about deciding what you want, a different sort of transport planning. So the questions for Aberdeen might be: what has actually happened factually to traffic levels since the original forecasts were done? I don't know the answer to that. It's the first thing I would have looked at if I'd done the visit we planned. How do the appraisals compare with the Treasury Green Book critique? What was the treatment of strategic coherence and uncertainty about the future explicit and satisfactory? That's the sort of questions I think we now have to ask about any project. And the other thing that keeps going around my mind is what's the model for a city like Aberdeen? Where is the experience? And that's where I think Freiburg, which I've mentioned twice in the last 20 minutes, is very, very interesting. Freiburg is about the same size as Aberdeen. It's not one of the great famous mega cities of this world or of Germany, just as Aberdeen is not a mega city. About the same population. They are both places of huge awareness of their history, a long history. Freiburg recently celebrated 900 years, but I think you might claim that you go back a fair way longer than that. But it is important because history is important, and culture, and the built culture of a city, urban consciousness and pride are something that has been a very great influence on the way in which planning has developed in the small but most radical thinking cities in Europe. Now, I think you'd really enjoy and find worthwhile a study visit to Freiburg. I mentioned that in advance of other cities in the UK. Of course, if such a thing as study visits ever becomes possible again, and that's up in the air at the moment. But if one wants to think internationally, I think they've got an awful lot to teach about what might be useful for you and what the future paths might be. Okay, that's as far as I want to do. Let me stop this share. Has that now left the screen? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and back to you, Gavin, and I'm in your hands.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Phil. That was extremely interesting. So, with so many of us in the meeting, I think we had initially said this would be a question and answer session, but Phil's indicated that he's quite happy to open it up as a bit more of a discussion. However, with 35 odd people in the meeting, obviously it's not going to work if we all try and talk at once. So there is a hands up, a virtual hands up function, I believe, which you should have at the bottom of your screen. And so I think probably the best way is if anybody that wants to ask a question or comment uses that function, and Rachel will just unmute microphones as we go. Is that going to work, Rachel?
Yep, you can also type in the chat. So if you have a question specifically and you'd rather not talk, you can type something in the chat. Otherwise, feel free, you can unmute now and speak. Okay.
The only other things I'll say is that we are going to finish by 2, because we said this was a 1 hour session, and some of us have got jobs to go back to. The other thing I should say is I have in the top left of my screen, and you may too, is an indication that this meeting is being recorded, and the purpose of that is that it will be shared on our website subsequently for those that weren't able to attend today. I hope Phil's okay with that. I forgot to ask him beforehand, but just for everyone else, just to be aware that your questions or comments are being recorded, and bear that in mind if you're making comments. Thanks. So any questions? While Rachel is looking for hands going up, I'll begin then. And I suppose my one of the things that strikes me about the situation in Aberdeen is that I think we're quite far behind other cities in terms of cycle lane provision, and the council has worked up and brought forward schemes, and they continue to do so, but the delivery seems to be quite slow. And it seems to me that council resources are very limited, and council resources are still going into designing and bringing forward road building schemes. So presumably, because council resources are not limitless, that has a bearing on the pace at which cycles schemes can be brought forward.
It's one of the worrying things, I think, about transport planning skills is that there is a disconnection between, on the one hand, priorities, and on the other hand, resources. So that one does see still huge teams of professionally qualified and expert trained people allocated to, let's say, one big roundabout, compared with maybe one or two or three people in an entire council who are responsible for a strategy for cycling and for pedestrians over a whole town. And where that happens, clearly the pace of change is going to be lower than any declaration of strategic importance. I do think we need a reallocation not only of road space but of professional skills as well, because you can't do it with a makeshift team. You need the same sort of traditions of professional excellence given to active transport as has been built up over the years in civil engineering for major schemes.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to I can't see the hands going up, but Rachel's messaging me to tell me who it is. So we'll go first to Councillor Sandra MacDonald.
I think
we're
you're
not
unmuted.
hearing you, Sandra.
Can you? I think you're unmuted. Could you? Try speaking now. Oh no, we can't, sorry.
Maybe it's just volume.
Yeah, can hear you now.
Oh, we can't hear you now, but you're a little bit faint. But
okay, I'll shout. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the presentation. It's very challenging times, as you say, and many things to take into account as we're looking at our transport strategy here in Aberdeen. We are in the process of developing our new regional transport strategy in line with the Scottish national one, and following on from that, there will be a local transport strategy that fits into that. And you know, we have 4 pillars on that. I won't go into all the detail, but it is there for people to look into. I suppose my question is around carbon, around Brexit, and all the other factors that you mentioned. When is a good time to your transport strategy? Because my experience has been that there's always something that can derail. And I suppose the other big thing for me is that connectivity is so important for economic growth and for Aberdeen. We are on the coast. We have maritime as well as air and road and rail links, and then we've got our infrastructure in the city. And so what would your view be on cities like Aberdeen, which have that sort of range of transport strategies to fit in to our thinking?
I suppose one would say that connectivity is important to everyone, isn't it? I mean, there are hardly any cities for which connectivity isn't important. The question is how one goes about getting that connectivity. There are some perhaps over optimism about the extent to which having better connectivity is going to generate solutions to economic problems whose real causes are quite elsewhere. You know, there's a feeling anywhere that wants their economy to expand, let's build a new road and then it'll happen. And of course, that isn't necessarily true. All roads have two directions, and they make it easier. If they make it easier for a place to serve other destinations, they also make it easier for other destinations to serve that place. And who actually ends up better or worse out of all this well, it's a bit unfortunate. In general, the experience has been that building better road connections to improve connectivity tends to work more to the benefit of the location at the richer end of that road than at the poorer end. So levelling up is not necessarily what you get. Sometimes it's levelling down. Having said that, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, clearly one's links with the rest of the region, the rest of the country and the rest of the world are vital. What I think we now have to do is think of ways of doing that which don't put so much stress on resources, especially on carbon, that we make things worse rather than better. And I do believe we've been doing that to a considerable extent, not only here, but in a large part of the, maybe nearly all of the rich countries of the world. We haven't really been good examples for the rest of the world to follow, I think. As to when, well, I suppose the old slogan is the best time to do it is 20 years ago. And the second best time is now. My points about the very specific situation that we've got at the moment with the crises that are facing us is that's a good time to actually think it through a bit. That'll repay. We can't actually do everything we want at the moment. Life doesn't allow us to, because it's too distracting, but we can go on thinking.
One of the other things that occurred to me, Phil, when you were talking about all these things that will affect the future is of course Aberdeen's particular position as having been oil capital, and it's going to have to reinvent itself. So, you know, isn't now a great time to reinvent itself as something better and not just having more of the same? We've got a couple of questions in the chat which I'll just read out so that you, and one was someone's asking if you're, having mentioned Freiburg, whether you're also familiar with Ghent and what they did there. I could throw in Seville to that because I know they did a very quick introduction of a very successful cycle lane scheme. The other question was just about the narrowness of some of our streets, and whether you have a view on, does it make sense to stick a cycle lane on a street that's also sharing with traffic, or is it a better model to just close some streets and make them exclusively for active travel?
Yeah, first to say, I mean, it's quite interesting. Freiburg, Ghent, and Seville are all examples of places that have been adopted quite radical, forward-looking policies that are slightly different from each other and which do stem from their own circumstance. You know, I like the way none of them have been have lifted a template of guidelines of how cities ought to be. They've worked it up themselves from their own citizens, and with good good buy-in from in terms of political and popular support, and all three of them are absolute pleasures to be in. During a couple of decades until recently, I was an avid traveller in Europe, and you know, it was a real pleasure to see those cities and other ones who are doing the same sort of thing. All that travel, of course, is you know, we don't know what the future of learning in that way is going to be, but it is important, I think, this idea that we are unique, but we're also part of a club with a lot of other cities that are unique, which share rather similar problems, and we can learn from each other. And the thing about narrow streets, it's rather interesting. The ones that I've seen, the old towns in historic cities, very historic, I mean, that go back to medieval street patterns or earlier, are often the ones that have found it easiest to do really radical policies where you don't try to use mixed traffic, you know, a bit of everything, because there simply isn't room. And people understand that. Because it's manifestly obvious, you know, you cannot allow parking and traffic both to operate in a street which is hardly wide enough for two cars to pass each other, and sometimes only just wide enough for one, and that's without any provision for pedestrians and cycles at all. So what they've tended to do is have more radical street closures associated with other measures to make the place nice to be in, so you still get the attractiveness, and alternative methods of getting to the town, so that this is where you do have trams, metros, sometimes quite compact ones, which can and cycles and pedestrians, which can get far more people in a very limited street capacity. It makes sense to me what you're saying.
Okay, thank you. We have a hand up from John Barron, so we'll go next to you, John. Just Rachel, are you? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Firstly for the input. Really interesting. I look forward to watching it back in there again, because I think there's a lot of food for thought for us all. And kudos to yourselves, Rachel and Gavin, for organising. It's been really helpful, I think. The only point I'd probably like to make with your presentation, Phil, I'd maybe be typically controversial, whilst I absolutely don't disagree with you that we have a lot to learn. My word, we have a lot to learn from Freiburg, Ghent, Seville, and others on the continent. A lot of what we're speaking about, a lot of what you're mentioning today is actually happening in the UK. I'm refreshed and reassured to see. At close quarters, I visited Greater Manchester with Sustrans colleagues, seen it on the ground, rather than in a lever arch file or on a computer screen as part of a study. It's actually happening. Now there are things, again, I'm refreshed and reassured, are happening in Scotland. So the demand for the public purse is never greater, and we all realise that. So whilst we could perhaps virtually maybe visit some of these places just now and learn, and as I say, my word, we have a lot to learn, but I think we can do it perhaps and be closer to home, and maybe we will have to do it closer to home for the foreseeable.
That's good to hear. I just mention one extra point on that. It's been a remarkable feature of the last 30 years that it's not always the leading cities that stay the leaders, and you get a leapfrogging effect. And quite often it's the ones that were finding it most difficult to make advances that then suddenly, almost out of the blue to the outsider, they're making huge steps forward. Paris now, okay, it's a different type of place, but it was always the place where motor traffic absolutely dominated the historic city. I mean, the culture of parking on pavements, parking on pedestrian crossings, very little cycling and so on. And within a year, that's been transformed. I mean, completely remarkable what they're doing now and planning in Paris. And I think the capital cities of this world, who've never really, I mean, everybody has always enjoyed Paris, but not for that reason. And I think that's also, you know, so I wouldn't, why not Aberdeen? You know, you've got a whole number of criteria which are very favourable, and it's really just a question of the determination and the goodwill and the political buy-in to do it, I think.
Thank you. One question we had submitted in advance of the meeting was about what proportion of transport budget is appropriate to fund active travel, because I think although the lots of government policies now reflect a transport hierarchy where they say that walking and cycling should be top, the allocation of funds is still very much the other way around, with them getting the smaller share. So do you have a view on what proportion is appropriate?
I noticed the question suggested 15%. I think a nice one to start with. The point of principle surely is that if the allocation of funds don't match the allocation of stated priorities, then the stated priorities are not being implemented. And where you've got this very firm and sincerely held hierarchy of objectives, which simply is turned upside down when it comes to the expenditure of budgets, then you know there's something wrong then. And it's one of the most difficult things to change, maybe, because of the, well, you're interfering with little empires, I suppose, aren't you, when you try to change budgets? But yeah, absolutely. I do think that that we need to be talking. Maybe if one thinks of it in expenditure per head of the population, you know, when we're talking about a need for something like 10, 20, 30 pounds per head of the population per year to make active travel comparable with provision for vehicle travel, and I think that's the direction that we should be moving in.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the chat again, and we have, I presume you can all see it, there's a question from Michelle, which is referencing villages or commuter towns on the outskirts of Aberdeen, you know, such as West Hill and Kings Wells, and saying, well, you know, there they are 4 miles apart, and yet there is no quality link for people to walk and cycle between them. How do we begin to get things like that in place? It's
can I just say, I've also just noticed another question in the chat inviting me to come again in a few years when you've leapfrogged the others. So I'll accept that invitation now if I'm still if I'm still active by the time you've done it. Thanks for that. Some of the most, I mean, accept the point, of course, of principle. This is important. It's a big problem. It's making life very difficult for a small number of people. And there's an equity issue there. Just because it's a small number doesn't mean to say that these difficulties are acceptable and can be tolerated. The experience so far of a place which seems to have got the best approach to this is Switzerland. And I don't quite know why that is, perhaps just because they have a lot more people living in very small communities and so on, but they've managed to get a way of integrating the transport facilities for small places together with the bigger facilities for travel, as it might be between towns. They're ensuring that the small places en route either to one of the towns or close to or the other are also getting a good share of clock-face timetable public transport facilities that are integrated with the timetables of the longer distance movements and so on. That seems to work very well. And the other aspect, of course, is the one of funds, which is a constraint, and attention. Quite a lot can be done with enforcement of laws and regulations which are already in place, but simply not followed. And that's why you get traffic obstruction in places where there shouldn't be traffic obstruction. That's not about budgets and building. That's just about making sure that facilities are clear when they ought to be. But I entirely agree that this is an area which is always going to be a knottier one than the in some ways simpler problems, more serious but simpler problems in the big towns, and it does require a pressure and a priority which it hasn't got.
Okay, I think Rachel, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I do. I was very interested in your graph that you had, the bar chart, where you were showing traffic capacity after pedestrianisation. In most places, the traffic had gone down. There were 6 where it had actually gone up. And so 2 things. I wondered first, are there examples where building a ring road has been positive, has been a good thing and was a good decision? I had wondered that myself because we've just done that in Aberdeen. We've essentially just opened the AWPR a couple of years ago, which is a ring road. And I was wondering at the time whether there are examples of these in other cities being beneficial across the board, I suppose beneficial in terms of not just the economy, but also people's health and environment and traffic and all those factors. And I couldn't find much information about this, but I'm sure it must have been studied before. And I also wondered what those 6 cities were.
On the last point, they were quite small places. I've got a list. I'll look out for them for you. And also the big report, which I showed the front cover on, has got quite a lot of detail, not only about the traffic accounts, but little stories about what had happened in each of the places. Okay. And how it fitted into their transport thing. It's a book-length report, and it's got a lot of interesting things, and it's also free online. So I'll get the link of that to you. I think my summary would be that ring roads at a reasonable distance surrounding a large central area where there has been very radical traffic reduction inside the central area, the whole thing seems to work well. But it doesn't happen spontaneously. The old strategy that existed for quite some years was you only had to build your ring road or your bypass, and that would just automatically take the traffic away from the places you didn't want it, and they were often called relief roads. And the building of the road would relieve the excessive traffic within it. And that doesn't seem to happen. The worst errors in forecasting traffic levels were in the roads that the relief roads were intended to relieve, if you follow me. What happened was that the relief road generated enough extra traffic for itself, but the lower congestion in the relieved areas, unaccompanied by traffic restraint measures, simply themselves filled up as well. So it was a double whammy in the wrong direction, if you like. Both of them ended up with more traffic. So, but yes, if you've got a major relief road, which a major ring road, which is associated with traffic reduction, active traffic reduction measures within, that seems to be quite a powerful combination. There have been a few cases where ring roads have actually themselves had their capacity reduced unexpectedly, also with favourable results. It's very specific to the area that one's talking about. But yeah, the stories in the traffic reduction book, and also some of the historical accounts I also put up just the front covers of Carmen Haas-Klau's two books, packed full of historical descriptions of how it all evolved over time, and what the politics were and what the traffic effects were. So that is there. I mean, the information is available.
Okay, Phil, we are almost at the end of our time. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that we haven't got to, but I think we're also starting to lose a couple of people, which maybe means that people have other appointments or things that they need to go to. I would like to thank you most sincerely for coming and giving us this presentation. I hope everyone else has found it as interesting and informative as I have. I very much hope that we will be able to have you come and visit Aberdeen one day and see firsthand our traffic challenges. And thanks to everyone else who has come along to the meeting. It's been a good attendance, which has made it a good use of Phil's time. As I said, we hope the recording will be available on the website for anyone that wasn't able to join today. And with that, I think we will sign off and finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, too.
Very much, everyone.
Good luck.
Thank you.